It all began the day my father decided to erase me from his life to keep his new wife happy. He turned his back on me, laughing behind closed doors while I stood silent, trying to hold myself together. What unfolded next would completely unravel their carefully crafted image of a perfect family. My name is Ellie, I'm 22, and what I'm about to share with you isn't some over-the-top family drama, it's my reality. I never imagined I'd be posting this for the world to see, but sometimes, life pushes you into corners you never thought you'd face. To understand how things spiraled, you need a bit of context. My mother, Sarah, was a woman of extraordinary strength and unwavering discipline. She planned everything meticulously, right down to the smallest details. She worked as a senior accountant, the kind of professional who always had her files perfectly labeled and archived. She kept every receipt, every policy, every legal document in pristine order. She even wrote a full will years before she ever got sick. At the time, I thought it was excessive, maybe even a little morbid. Now, I understand it was her way of protecting me. She used to say, "I just want to make sure you're going to be okay no matter what happens." That's the kind of person she was, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always taking care of everything so others wouldn't have to. When she passed away from intestinal cancer when I was just 18, I felt like my world collapsed. If you've ever watched someone you love fade away slowly, losing pieces of themselves day by day, you know how soul-crushing it is. Mom fought with every ounce of strength for 4 grueling years. She never once complained. She left her job to dedicate herself entirely to her treatment, and somehow, even in her weakest moments, she kept planning. She spent those years making sure every bit of paperwork, every account, every future plan for me was in order. She made sure I'd have a place to live, made sure I wouldn't struggle with finances, made sure I wouldn't be lost. Before she passed, she took my hands in hers and said, "Ellie, this house is yours now. It's your sanctuary. Please promise me you'll protect it." I was barely a legal adult, just weeks away from starting college, and I had no idea how to manage her property. But I knew one thing for certain: that house was the last living piece of her legacy. She bought it before she ever met my father. She'd worked tirelessly to pay off the mortgage, transforming it into a warm, beautiful home filled with memories and love. It was hers through and through, and she made it explicitly clear in her will that it would be passed down to me and no one else. That house was her gift, her final protection, her way of ensuring I'd always have stability. Enter my dad. My parents separated when I was 9. It wasn't some explosive breakup, no screaming matches, no bitter court battles. He simply walked away. He'd met someone new, a woman named Diane, and chose to start a new chapter without us. They married not long after and soon had my half-sister Maya. To be honest, I wasn't bitter back then. I didn't even have the energy to be. I just accepted that I had become a distant echo in my father's new life. One thing he did do right was to set aside a lump sum in a separate account to pay for my college. I suppose that was his version of child support. I appreciated it, of course, but emotional support was something I learned to live without. I visited occasionally for holidays, and while Diane was never outwardly cruel, she never welcomed me either. She had that performative politeness, the kind where she'd invite me to dinner with a plastic smile, her voice too sweet to be genuine. "Ellie, of course you're welcome to stay for dinner," she'd say, spoon in hand as she stirred a pot of something aromatic, but her eyes always darted away, her tone cheerful to be sincere. It was painfully obvious she was hoping I'd decline. My dad stayed busy, always hustling to provide for Diane and Maya. Maya, who was a decade younger than me, was bubbly and innocent. I did my best to connect with her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just a visitor in a place where I didn't truly belong. Their house was modest, rented, nothing luxurious but comfortable enough. And yet, every time I stepped through that door, it felt like I was trespassing. That kind of emotional alienation isn't easy to describe. It's the cold absence of inclusion, the quiet signals that you're just a guest, not family. When my mom passed, I was paralyzed by grief. I couldn't even begin to figure out what to do with the house. I was lost, emotionally wrecked, and incapable of making major decisions. That's when Dad and Diane showed up, just after the funeral. To my surprise, they offered to stay for the summer to help me adjust. "Ellie," my father said gently, "you can't handle this place all by yourself right now. Let us stay with you for a while. We'll take care of things so you can focus on healing." I was too broken to argue. The silence in the house was deafening. My mother's absence was a constant ache, a void that echoed through the halls. Diane wore a mask of sympathy, murmuring comforting words while patting my back. Maya, young and oblivious, roamed the house as if it were her new playground. I remember retreating to what used to be my mom's office, now technically mine. I sat in her chair, stared at the degrees on the wall, the meticulously organized ledgers and folders, and felt like I was trespassing in a museum of her life. I couldn't even bring myself to touch her belongings. So I let them stay. My father and Diane moved into the spare bedroom. Maya took over what used to be my mother's craft room. I told myself it was temporary, just until I left for college in the fall. But as summer waned and my departure approached, Dad sprung a new idea during breakfast. He pushed aside his coffee cup, looked me in the eye and said, "Ellie, what if we stayed here while you're away? It'll be easier for everyone. You won't have to worry about maintenance, the house won't be empty, and we'll keep everything running smoothly." Diane chimed in from the stove, flipping pancakes like it was a cozy family sitcom. "We'll take great care of it, Ellie. You'll come back and everything will be just the way you left it." At the time, it sounded reasonable. They had been fairly respectful housemates over the summer. Diane even seemed to soften, inviting me to her quirky little book club sessions, where a bunch of middle-aged women giggled over cheesy romance novels. Maya began calling me her cool big sister, which, despite everything, did warm my heart. So I agreed. I trusted them. Why wouldn't I? Honestly, for a while, everything seemed perfectly fine. Diane would go all out preparing massive welcome-home meals whenever I returned during college breaks. My dad, with his goofy grin, would toss out his usual batch of corny dad jokes that made me groan and laugh in equal measure. Maya, now in middle school, would eagerly pull me aside to vent about her latest classroom drama, who liked who betrayed whom, and the tragic saga of a forgotten birthday party invite. It started to feel like we'd somehow morphed into this quirky patchwork family that, while unconventional, actually worked. Sure, there were minor annoyances, like Diane redecorating the house bit by bit or her passive-aggressive remarks that occasionally felt like veiled critiques of my mother's tastes, but I brushed them off. It didn't seem worth arguing over. I told myself, pick your battles. And besides, I wasn't living there full-time. I convinced myself we were all adapting, learning how to coexist. Then, during the spring of my senior year, I called my dad with the news I'd been holding on to with excitement bubbling in my chest. I had just accepted a job back in my hometown, my first real job after college, the first step into adulthood. My dad's reaction? Pure enthusiasm. "That's amazing, Ellie. We'll make sure the house is all ready for you," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. I didn't think twice about it. After graduation, I packed my belongings, filled my car with boxes of books, clothes, and memories, and took the long drive home. It was one of those glowing early summer days when everything feels full of promise. I kept thinking how lucky I was to be starting my career back in the place that held so many memories. My heart was light, my head full of plans. I was 22, fresh out of school, and ready to return to the only place that had ever truly felt like mine, my mother's house. When the taxi pulled up in front of the house, though, a small ripple of unease swept through me. The front of the house looked different. Subtle changes, nothing glaring, but enough to make me pause. The curtains hanging in the windows weren't the ones Mom had picked out. They were newer, more modern, not her style at all. The rose bushes lining the front path, her pride and joy, had been trimmed into stiff, round shapes, the way Diane liked to prune everything. And the porch, it had a fresh coat of paint, a brighter shade than before. Still, I shrugged it off. Diane had always been hands-on with home aesthetics, and I figured they'd just tried to keep the place looking nice. I climbed the porch steps with my suitcase in one hand, took a deep breath of that familiar air tinged with roses and cut grass, and pulled out my key. It didn't fit. I stared at the lock for a moment, confused. Maybe I grabbed the wrong key from my keyring? I tried again. Nothing. I turned it this way and that, jiggled the doorknob, even checked to see if the key was bent. But no, it simply didn't work. My pulse picked up. Maybe they'd changed the locks because of a break-in? Or maybe the door was just jammed? I knocked lightly, still holding on to hope. A moment later, Diane opened the door. She wore an apron dusted with flour, her hair pulled back, and she looked like she'd been in the middle of baking something. For a fleeting second, her expression went completely blank, like she'd seen a ghost. Then, just as quickly, she forced on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ellie, what are you doing here?" Her question hit me like a slap. "What am I doing here?" I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm moving back in. I told you guys, remember? I got the job in town." Diane blinked like she was struggling to recall a minor detail. "Oh, right," she mumbled, as if she'd just remembered we needed milk. She stepped aside with obvious reluctance and gestured for me to come in. I rolled my suitcase over the threshold and instantly felt a jarring disconnect. This was my house, but it no longer felt like it. The bones were the same, Mom's sofa, her antique coffee table, but everything had been rearranged. Diane's tacky country-style decorations had multiplied. Fake plants everywhere, farmhouse signs saying things like, "Home is where the heart is," and "Live, laugh, love" hung from walls that once held framed family photos. The most painful absence? The photo of Mom and me that used to sit on the side table by the couch. It was gone. In its place stood a staged portrait of Dad, Diane, and Maya, all smiles, arms linked, like they were the only family that mattered. My chest tightened, but I tried to stay calm. In the living room, Dad looked up from his tablet. He was sitting in Mom's favorite chair, the one she used to curl up in with a book and a blanket after long days at work. His eyes widened when he saw me, and for a moment he looked like a deer caught in headlights. Maya lay stretched across the couch, earbuds in, texting furiously. She barely glanced up. "Oh hey, you're back." "Yeah," I replied quietly. "Why were the locks changed?" Dad scratched the back of his neck, his classic nervous tell. I changed them a few weeks ago. There were some break-ins nearby, and I just wanted to be cautious." "You didn't think to give me a new key?" My voice had an edge now, sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. Diane chimed in from the kitchen. "We didn't expect you back so soon." "I graduated last week," I said, looking from her to my dad. "I sent you the date I'd be moving in weeks ago." Diane didn't reply. She just crossed her arms and gave me that look, the kind that says, "You're causing a problem." My dad stood in motion toward Mom's old office. "Ellie, can we talk? Just us?" he asked. I followed him, my suitcase trailing behind me like an anchor. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The office looked mostly the same. Mom's desk, her books, but I noticed some of her things had been nudged aside to make space for Diane's binders and decorative storage bins. Dad closed the door, turned to face me, and I could see it in his eyes. He was bracing for a reaction. "Listen," he started, his tone quiet, his fingers twitching at his sides. "There's something I need to tell you." Those words made the room spin. My stomach knotted. I knew deep down I wasn't going to like whatever came next. "She thinks this house is mine," Dad confessed, eyes dropping to the floor like the weight of his own words was too much to bear. "She believes I let you stay here after your mother passed." I stared at him, the silence hanging heavy between us. My brain couldn't register what he was saying. What? He let out a deep, guilt-ridden sigh and continued, "I never told her the truth. I told Diane that I gave this house to your mom in the divorce, and that it reverted back to me when she died." For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This was my house, my mother's house, the very thing she had worked herself to the bone to ensure I would have a piece of her to keep me safe long after she was gone. And my dad, he'd lied. For 4 years. He kept talking, still avoiding my eyes. "I had to, Ellie. You don't understand. Diane would have never agreed to live here if she thought it wasn't mine." My voice finally returned, shaky and cold. "So, what, you let her believe this house was hers, that she had some kind of claim, and now I'm supposed to what? Vanish into thin air and just pretend this is all fine?" He reached out, placing a hand on my arm, his voice desperate. No, that's not what I meant. Just, please, give me a little time. I'll tell her, I swear. I just need to figure out how to say it. I don't want to ruin my marriage over this." That broke me. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to love me unconditionally. My own father was asking me to bury the truth, to live a lie, to keep my mouth shut just so he could preserve his second marriage. The betrayal crashed over me like a tidal wave. All I could do was nod numbly when he handed me a key to the new locks. I didn't believe a word of his promise. I took the key anyway, not because I trusted him, but because I was done arguing. I felt sick to my stomach, like I'd just swallowed something rotten. My chest ached with the kind of betrayal that burrows into your bones. That night, dinner was a silent battlefield. Diane sat at the head of the table, her smile unnervingly bright, as though nothing had happened. But I saw it. Those sharp, assessing glances she kept throwing my way, like she knew something was off, like she could smell the tension. Maya ignored me completely, absorbed in her phone, headphones in. And Dad? He was a ghost, barely there, barely speaking. I poked at my food, my mind spiraling. The worst part was knowing this was just the beginning. I could feel the undercurrents shifting, sense the hostility that was starting to bubble just beneath the surface. You know that feeling when no one says anything outright, but every silence, every glance screams louder than words ever could? That was my new reality. Living with Diane quickly became a masterclass in unspoken aggression. She didn't shout, she didn't openly criticize, but her every move, every word was laced with a message: you don't belong here. Dad wasn't any better. He avoided me entirely, retreating into silence like a coward, hoping maybe if he pretended everything was fine, it would magically fix itself. It was like being trapped in someone else's house, only it was my house. The one place that was supposed to be safe, sacred, now, it felt like enemy territory. The first few days were awkward but survivable. I stayed mostly in my room, unpacking, texting friends, trying to digest everything my dad had dumped on me. The house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of what it was and the growing realization of what it had become. Diane started making little comments, never directly confrontational but always barbed. One morning, as I was making coffee, she wandered into the kitchen and said with a smile, "Oh, you're up early. Guess you're still on that college kid schedule, huh?" Then she eyed the food on the stove and added, "Or are you making dinner for yourself tonight? I didn't realize you'd be eating in." She said it sweetly, but every word dripped with passive aggression. Then things escalated. One Wednesday, I had sorted my laundry into neat piles in the laundry room. I stepped away briefly to grab detergent from the hallway closet. When I came back, Diane was there, pulling my clothes out of the washer, mixing my whites with unwashed darks and tossing them into a laundry basket. I stood there, stunned. She looked up with mock surprise and said, "Oh, I thought this was Maya's. You really should label your stuff, Ellie." "They were sorted," I replied flatly, "and Maya doesn't do her own laundry, does she?" She smiled that tight, fake smile. "Well, I can't keep track of everyone's mess around here." With that, she picked up her cup of tea and walked out, leaving my clothes in a tangled mess. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was pushing, baiting me, trying to provoke a reaction, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. That night, I came to the dinner table and found only 3 plates set, one for Dad, one for Diane, one for Maya, none for me. I stood there, looking at the table, then at Diane. She looked up at me and said, all innocence, "Oh, Ellie, I thought you were eating out tonight. You didn't say anything." "I live here," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You didn't ask," she replied with a shrug. Then, with a sweet smile, "There's bread in the pantry if you're hungry." I stood frozen, debating whether to scream or leave. In the end, I chose silence. I grabbed my coat and walked out, the tension clinging to me like smoke. I ended up at a quiet diner on the edge of town, picking at a cold sandwich and staring at my phone. I texted Emily, an old friend from high school. "Please tell me you're free tomorrow. I need to get out of that house." The next morning, I met up with her. Emily still lived nearby, and when I told her everything about the house, the lies, the way Diane had essentially taken over, her eyes went wide. "Wait, what? They're living in your house and treating you like a guest?" Emily's eyes widened in disbelief, her voice sharp with outrage. "Ellie, what the hell?" I exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of everything I'd been bottling up. "I don't know what to do. My dad, he's too much of a coward to come clean with Diane, and she's been making my life a living hell ever since I came back. I feel like I'm losing my mind." We spent that afternoon sitting in her backyard, the sun warming our skin as we drank iced tea and caught up on life. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. Emily cracked a joke about storming the house if Diane pushed me any further. "Just say the word and I'll show up with a baseball bat and a lawyer." We both laughed, but beneath my smile was a quiet dread already taking root again. Because I knew the moment I walked back into that house, the pressure would return. Sure enough, when I got home, the atmosphere shifted the second I crossed the threshold. The house was eerily quiet, dimly lit. I flipped the hallway light switch and immediately noticed something small, yet telling. My shoes, which I'd left neatly by the door, had been moved into the coat closet. A minor thing, yes, but it screamed a message loud and clear. Diane didn't want any trace of me in her home. And she didn't stop there. Over the following week, it became a pattern. I'd go to grab my favorite mug for coffee, only to find it shoved behind piles of mismatched dishware. My mail, buried beneath junk flyers and catalogs, barely distinguishable. One morning, I shuffled into the bathroom, ready for a hot shower, only to be met with icy water. Apparently, Maya had taken a 45-minute shower right before me. Diane clucked her tongue and smiled sweetly. "Oh, Ellie, you'll just have to start getting up earlier. Maya's a growing girl, she needs more time." It was all so deliberate. What cut even deeper, though, was the way Maya had changed. When she was younger, she'd followed me around everywhere, begging me to braid her hair and calling me her cool big sister. Now, she rolled her eyes the moment I entered a room and muttered things under her breath. I overheard her one evening on the phone, whispering, "I don't even know why she's still here. It's not like it's her house." That one hurt, more than I expected. And Dad? Dad was suddenly a ghost in his own home. He'd come in late from work or disappear for long walks when Diane started picking at me. When I tried to talk to him alone, to beg him to set things right, he'd murmur things like, "Just let it be," or "We have to keep the peace." But keeping the peace meant keeping me silent, invisible, expendable. My breaking point came one Thursday evening. I walked into the living room and froze. On the mantel, once a carefully arranged altar of family memories, Mom's favorite vase was gone. In its place was one of Diane's tacky farmhouse signs, a faux rustic wooden plaque that read "Home Sweet Home" in curly script. I looked around and finally found the vase shoved on a corner shelf, half hidden behind a stack of magazines. That vase had been there for as long as I could remember, pale ceramic with delicate blue floral designs. It was a wedding gift to my mother from her late grandmother. It wasn't just decoration, it was history. I confronted Diane immediately. "Why did you move the vase?" She didn't even look up from her tablet. "It didn't match the new style I'm going for, you understand, right?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. But inside, something cracked. I realized then and there I couldn't keep playing along. I couldn't keep swallowing my anger and pretending like I didn't notice the way they were trying to erase every trace of my mother I heard my sister making out. That night, I lay awake in bed mentally packing Diane's belongings. I wasn't ready to act yet, but the idea was growing. Roots. By Saturday, I felt like a squatter in my own home. Every shared space felt hostile. I avoided the kitchen unless I was certain it was empty. I tiptoed around the living room, knowing Diane would glare if I dared turn on the TV. I only felt safe in my room, and even then, barely. But that Saturday morning was different. It was the silence that woke me. No sound of Diane clattering pots, no Maya shrieking into her phone, no Dad watching the morning news. I padded out into the hallway, still in my pajamas, and something felt off. The kitchen? Immaculate. Countertops gleamed, no crumbs, no clutter. The dining table was bare, chairs perfectly aligned. Even the pile of shoes that usually crowded the front door was gone. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no texts. Weird. I tried calling Dad straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. Panic began to creep in. After everything that had happened, my mind couldn't accept this as a coincidence. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Finally, I called Diane. I was about to hang up when she answered, her tone clipped and cold. "What do you want?" I woke up and the house is empty. Where is everyone?" She laughed. Not a real laugh. It was sharp, cruel. "Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives. Sunny beaches, luxury resort. The whole deal." I blinked. "The Maldives? What?" "First-class flights and everything," she added cheerfully. "We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you tagging along. You're not exactly in a position to pay your way, are you?" My stomach churned. "What are you talking about?" That's when she dropped the cheerful mask completely. "I'm talking about you living in our house like some entitled brat," she snapped. "Your father might be too soft to say it, but I'm not. You've been freeloading long enough, Ellie, mooching off our generosity while acting like the victim." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She continued, venom in every word. "You think you're so special because your mom left you this place. Guess what? That was years ago. You don't get to waltz in here and act like we owe you something. This is our home now. You're just a squatter with a sob story." The call ended with a click. Silence again. Except this time, it roared in my ears. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have a grown woman squatting in our house while we foot all the bills?" Diane's voice crackled through the phone, dripping with venom. I sat frozen, the handset clutched tightly in my trembling hand. My breath caught in my throat as my knees buckled, and I collapsed into one of the kitchen chairs, the cold wood digging into my back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "It's not your house," I managed to whisper, my voice brittle and weak. "It's my house." She didn't even pause. "We're done, Ellie. When we get back, I want you gone. I don't care where you go, sleep on a park bench for all I care. But you are not staying here. If you're still there when we return, I will personally throw you out." In the background, I heard Maya laughing and carefree, and my father's muffled voice saying something I couldn't quite catch. That somehow hurt more than Diane's cruelty. The sound of him casually talking while his wife tore me apart. It twisted the knife deeper than I thought possible. "Don't bother trying to call your father," Diane cut in sharply. "He agrees with me. He's just too spineless to say it out loud. We've already blocked your number, so don't even try." And then the line went dead. I sat there in stunned silence. The stillness of the house pressed down on me like a weighted blanket. My gaze remained fixed on the phone, half expecting her to call back and reveal it was some cruel, elaborate joke. But that call never came, and the silence from my father on the other end said everything I needed to know. They were gone, on vacation, on some pristine beach, sipping tropical drinks, probably laughing at how clever they thought they were, at how they'd left me behind in what they still dared to call their house. And worst of all, they weren't coming back to talk, they were coming back to throw me out. The numbness didn't last long. The shock, the confusion, it all morphed into something sharper, something alive. Rage. I hadn't felt real anger in weeks, not like this. But now, it burned through my chest, hot and blinding. They wanted me gone? Fine. But they'd forgotten one critical detail. This house was mine. I sat in that kitchen chair for over an hour, staring at the same wall, the call replaying in my mind like a record on loop. Diane's voice kept echoing, freeloader, squatter, embarrassing. The way she said those words with such disdain, like I was dirt under her designer shoes, it stung deeper than anything else. She spoke as if I didn't exist, like I was some pathetic intruder clinging to a life I had no right to. Well, she was wrong. By noon, I had a plan. Step 1, cut them off. I blocked their numbers, Diane's, Dad's, even Maya's. I didn't want another word from any of them, not even an apology, assuming one would ever come. Step 2, reclaim my space. I picked up the phone and called an emergency locksmith. "Is this urgent?" the man on the other end asked. "Yes," I replied, voice shaking but firm, "as soon as possible." He arrived that same afternoon, an older gentleman with a kind face and a quiet understanding in his eyes. He didn't ask many questions, just did his job. Every lock in the house was replaced, front door, back door, garage, everything. It wasn't cheap, but at that point, I didn't care. As he handed me the new keys, he asked, "Anyone else have copies?" "Any more," I said. The moment he left, I began packing. Their things, every last piece of it, were going. I grabbed trash bags and cardboard boxes and started in the master bedroom. Diane's clothes, neatly folded into bags. Her absurdly overpriced skincare bottles and hair tools, tossed in a box. Her makeup trays, jewelry stands, and endless spa products, gone. Next, I tackled Maya's room. Toys, books, school papers, everything went into boxes. I even found one of my old photo albums shoved under her bed. I added it to the pile, a reminder of what this house had once been. Dad's golf clubs, the ones he never used but bragged about constantly, into the garage. His fishing gear, his ancient treadmill collecting dust in the guest room, boxed and labeled. By sunset, the garage looked like a storage unit piled high with their possessions, sealed and ready to go. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but also liberated. Every trip back into the house felt like a breath of fresh air. That evening, I collapsed on the living room couch. The space, finally free from Diane's cluttered decor, looked peaceful. The fake plants were gone, the cheesy signs had been taken down. The mantel now held the vase again, Mom's vase. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows. I brewed coffee in silence, sitting in Mom's old chair, the aroma filling the house like it used to. For a moment, it almost felt like she was there with me. I knew this wasn't over. Diane wouldn't take this lying down. And as for Dad, I had no idea where he stood anymore. But one thing I was sure of. I wasn't going anywhere. That Friday, the storm finally arrived. I'd known it was coming. I'd spent the week preparing for it, running through every possible scenario, every word I'd need to say. I'd rehearsed what I'd tell them, how I'd stand my ground, how I wouldn't let them twist my words or guilt me into submission. That afternoon, I got home from work, dropped my bag by the door, and took a deep breath. The house was quiet, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that meant peace, my peace. I had just settled onto the couch with my laptop to catch up on emails when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The crunch of tires on gravel made my heart jump, but I forced myself to stay seated. Doors slammed. Footsteps stormed toward the house. I didn't flinch. Not anymore. And then came the sound I had anticipated all week, the frantic rattling of the front doorknob, followed by loud, angry pounding. Diane's voice shrieked from the other side, rising in pitch with each failed attempt to open the door. "Ellie, what the hell is going on? Why won't the door open?" I let her fume and bang for a solid 30 seconds. I wanted her to feel it, the helplessness, the lack of control, the confusion. I stood slowly, walked over to the counter, and picked up the new set of keys I'd had made just days earlier. With deliberate slowness, I made my way to the door. I waited just long enough to relish the sudden pause in her shouting, then twisted the key and opened it. There she stood, Diane, livid, disheveled, her face a furious red and her hair a frizzy mess from the humidity outside. She looked like a woman on the brink of self-combustion. Behind her, my father stood stiff, his posture tight and his eyes avoiding mine. He looked everywhere except at me. Maya lingered near the car, arms crossed, her brows drawn in a deep scowl as she clutched her phone like a lifeline. Diane immediately tried to storm past me, barking, "What did you do? Why did you change the locks?" I stepped aside calmly, letting her barrel into the entryway like she owned the place. Dad followed her silently, his shoulders slouched with the weight of shame. Maya trailed behind, hesitant, barely stepping into the house. "I want an explanation right now," Diane snapped, turning to me with her hands on her hips. I folded my arms and stood tall, meeting her fury with a cool, unshaken stare. "It's pretty simple," I said evenly. "This is my house. You don't live here anymore." Diane's jaw dropped. For a moment she looked as if I'd slapped her. "Your house?" "Yes, my house," I said again, firmer now. "The house my mom bought, the house she left to me, the home you've been squatting in under a lie for the last 4 years. For a breathless second, the room went completely still. Diane turned sharply toward my father, her face twisted with disbelief and growing rage. "What is she talking about?" My dad didn't say a word. He stood frozen, his lips parted but voiceless. I turned to him, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Tell her, Dad, tell her the truth." Diane rounded on him. "What truth? What is she saying?" He mumbled something too low to hear, his voice barely audible. "Speak up," Diane demanded, her voice cracking under pressure. "What is she talking about, Richard?" Dad finally looked up. His face was ghostly pale, his hands trembling slightly. "It's true," he said, each word heavy with shame. "The house, it's not mine, it never was. Sarah bought it before we got married. She left it to Ellie in her will." Diane's eyes widened. She blinked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, struggling to make sense of what she'd just heard, and then, as realization sank in, her face flushed a darker shade of red. "You lied to me," she hissed. Dad recoiled as if she'd slapped him. "I didn't mean..." "You told me this was your house," she screeched. "You said you let Ellie stay here because you were being generous. You made me think..." She stopped, clutching her head in disbelief. "Do you know how stupid that makes me look?" Her voice had risen to a volume that probably carried to the neighbors. "I didn't care. Let them hear. Let them witness it all. After weeks of living like a stranger in my own home, I was done keeping the peace." Diane spun back to me, her eyes blazing. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you..." I raised a hand, stopping her mid-rant. "Everything you've done for me? Like what? Redecorating my mother's home? Calling me a freeloader? Plotting to throw me out of my own house while vacationing on a beach?" Her mouth opened, ready for another round, but I cut her off again. "Your stuff is in the garage. Take it. Leave." Maya finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "Mom, let's just go." She looked at me for a brief moment, something flickering in her eyes. Maybe embarrassment, maybe regret. Then she looked away. But Diane wasn't done. "We are not leaving," she barked. "This is our home too." "No, it's not," I said, calm and firm. "It's mine. And I want you out." Dad stepped forward, looking like he might cry. "Ellie, please," he said, his voice barely holding together. "We don't have anywhere to go right now. Just give us a few weeks." I shook my head and held up a hand. "No." His face collapsed in on itself. "Sweetheart, I know I messed up, but we're still family. We can fix this." I stared at him, my voice cold. "Family doesn't treat each other like this. You let her think this was her house. You let her bully me. You watched it all happen and said nothing." He had no answer. He just looked down, shame burning through him like sunlight through paper. Diane, however, wasn't about to surrender. "You're a selfish little girl," she spat. "You think you're so noble because of this house? You wouldn't even have it if it weren't for your father." I laughed, a sharp, bitter laugh. "My father had nothing to do with this house. Mom bought it with her own money. Before you, before him, she made sure it would be mine because she knew I couldn't count on him." That silenced her. I turned to Dad, who looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of his own regret. "You can take your things and go. I'm done." For a moment, no one moved. Diane stared at me with such intensity I thought she might lunge at me, but Dad finally exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he whispered. It took them about an hour to pack up everything I'd already boxed. Diane muttered angrily the entire time, tossing insults under her breath, her pride too bruised to accept what was happening. Dad moved like a hollow shell of himself, and Maya stayed quiet, her eyes darting between all of us as she helped carry things to the car. Finally, when the last box was loaded, Dad returned to the door and knocked softly one last time. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood by the window, hidden behind the curtain, and watched in silence as they drove away. Diane's voice still carried faintly through the glass, sharp, bitter, and distant, like the final note of a song you never wanted to hear again. But as their car turned the corner and disappeared from view, a calm washed over me, the kind that comes only after a long, unforgiving storm. For the first time in years, the house was quiet. Truly quiet. Not empty, not tense, not waiting for the next blow-up, just still. And in that stillness, something clicked into place. This house was mine again. It belonged to me, and to my mother's memory, her laughter, her scent, her resilience. It was all here, layered into every room, every creaking floorboard, every blooming petal in the garden. I sank onto the couch, the same spot where I had cried, hoped, and felt helpless, and I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. They were gone, finally. It's been 2 months since that day. Dad still tries to reach out, calling from unknown numbers like I wouldn't recognize his silence, but I don't answer. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, and truthfully, I've made peace with that. I've thrown myself into work, new job, new friends, a new version of me, stronger, wiser, free. I even replanted Mom's roses in the garden, choosing a new variety she would have loved. Deep red, with petals like velvet and a scent that stays in the air. And now, every morning, I walk through that garden and smile. Not because everything's perfect, but because it's finally mine, my home, my peace. To anyone facing the weight of toxic family, remember, you don't owe your happiness to anyone who tries to destroy it.